Back when I was younger, my father had a 72-gallon Beaufort tank. It was a beautiful reef tank filled with colorful fish and corals, the waving anemone, the gobies darting in and out of the rocks. And the soothing hum of the pumps were my first real experience with keeping fish. Eventually, he started to let me help out. He first got it when I was pretty young. I learned how to mix the food and feed with the turkey baster, and even though I had to stand on a stool to reach the top, we took trips together to the fish store, and he encouraged me to help him with research when he wanted to get new species. And that's a really valuable skill I learned from him. Never impulse buy. I learned how to read a refractometer and how to test the water parameters, and I was really lucky to have that kind of introduction into the hobby. As I've been working more on my conservation project and engaging more with everyone across social media, I decided to create this little mini documentary series about my life and kind of the engagement with freshwater conservation, as well as the history of the project as a whole, especially over the last 4 years that I've been in university, and it has really changed a lot. I hope you guys find this helpful and that you can see how much this project and freshwater conservation means to me. I guess the first part is I decided during middle school that I wanted my own tank, and using some of the money I saved up, I used $100 to buy a 26 Beaufort off of Craigslist. It came with the filters, the pumps, the lights. I set it up and carefully cycled it. I was really excited to put fish inside, so the weight was the hardest part. The next few months were the real tests, though. I learned how to do my own water changes and lift the 5-gallon buckets to the drain. I learned how to eyeball how much water I needed to put back in, and to be able to tell the temperature just by sticking my finger under the tap before putting it in the tank. I learned the hard way about quarantining. I feel like a lot of people make this mistake. When Ick killed over half the tank after I got a sick fish from a store, and I almost quit the hobby. I was really upset. It's just a fish, is what I was told a lot, but they were never really just fish to me.
Some golden ones, you've got the reds.
And their lives didn't matter less.
And I have to say, I'm
still not quite sure what they represent, but it was so much more than just a fish. You know, my fish tank is a little section of the natural world for me to see and interact with, and something I can watch and feel calm about. That was my only tank for a little while, that 26-gallon Beaufort, but I'm sure many of you have experienced this. It was not that way for long. Eventually, I convinced my parents to let me add a 75-gallon tank to the mix, saying that it would be the last one. I lied. With the 75-gallon, I added discus and angelfish to my repertoire, and I started breeding longfin green dragons, which were still pretty new at the time. So that's one of the benefits of living in the same state as Greg Sage, is we did kind of almost get like that early access to some of the strains that he created. But then really all snowballed from there. I started to find more tanks in thrift stores, free on Craigslist or cheap at garage sales, and I would spend a few hours every weekend getting rid of hard water stains and cleaning the tanks with vinegar before adding them to my collection. You know, I always just needed another quarantine tank. You know, I wasn't going to keep it set up forever. Soon I was breeding dwarf crayfish and bettas, guppies, ghost crayfish, axolotls, and so many more other things. It was at that point that it stopped being enough just to have the fish. Like, don't get me wrong, I really loved it and all of my tanks, but the people around me were getting tired of hearing me talk about it. And so I knew that I needed to find a group of people who kind of shared that passion. So I joined the Colorado Aquarium Society. And that kind of pushed me forward even more. And I even ended up becoming a member of the board for a few years during high school. I was the coordinator of youth activities and getting younger members kind of engaged in the hobby and keeping up the numbers, because a lot of the people in the hobby were a lot older. I also created a youth-only bidding section where the older members could donate items to it and allow children to bid on a more even playing field, because an adult's income and a child's income are very different things. Soon I was building stands with my dad on the weekend. I was lucky, he's always been very handy. And when we moved, I was able to claim part of the unfinished basement as my own, and I ended up with around 25 tanks, plus or minus some. And those were probably some of my favorite memories, despite the stress of school and of moving. One night we were at dinner at this Asian restaurant, and I saw a massive silver arowana in the tank. And at the time, I didn't know what it was called, but it was essentially love at first sight. And I looked up dragonfish because I had vaguely remembered seeing it somewhere online. And that's when I learned more about the Asian arowana. And my love for that species grew exponentially. I knew I wanted to keep Asian arowana someday, and I was devastated to learn that there were a lot of barriers. So if you live in the US, or if you know anything about the US in terms of fish, you'll know that it is illegal to keep Asian arowana due to its status as an endangered species, even though all the ones available for the hobby are captive bred. They're carefully microchipped and tracked, but apparently that's not enough. So I personally think that the legislation is outdated. And I could go on a whole tangent, but that was just one of the things I noticed needed to be improved in the hobby. So as I started to look into getting rarer species, common ones just didn't give me that high anymore. I started to notice that the IUCN had many other species that I wanted to keep marked as data deficient or other unknown statuses, and I had to look deeper for more information, and one thing led to another. So soon, I was sucked into the world of freshwater conservation. At first, it was just a really selfish way to try and get around the legislation. I really wanted to breed and research Asian arowana and other endangered species to help reestablish its presence in the wild and alleviate poaching and illegal import of fish into the States. But most of all, I wanted to keep them. So there was like this funny dynamic at play. So if I could be a conservation group working with the species, I would be able to have my dream fish. I would be able to get the permits to keep it. But then it became more. Just like everything else, it just kept going. I guess this has been a really long-winded way to provide some background on my involvement with the hobby, but we're not really here to talk about just that. We're mostly here to talk about the last 4 years. And in this first video, we're going to be focusing on my freshman year at Minerva University and how my personal life and my life in fish have been deeply intertwined with each other. Freshman year, I'm going to tell you guys the story of how I ended up at a university that travels to 7 countries over 4 years. So for a while, I was thinking of going to a small liberal arts college in Ohio, since I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. But at the last minute, I got an email about this new university with a novel education program and intensive study abroad. So I applied. I wasn't expecting anything. I only applied 2 days before their final deadline, and I felt like I had rushed the application and that there was no way I was going to get in. And their application was completely different from what I was expecting. So first off, it was free. And if you know anything about college admissions, you'll know that a lot of times you have to pay to submit an application, you have to pay to get your SAT or ACT scores sent. But even after that, ignoring that, it asked me, how many uses I could list for a piece of paper. It asked me how I would solve a problem if I were in a flooded building. And at some point they did ask for the normal list of accomplishments, but they never asked for my GPA or standardized test scores. And their acceptance letter was so nerve-wracking because they sent this video and you open it and it goes, Minerva University is innovative, special program, but it's not for everyone. So at that point I was like, oh, I got rejected. I wish they had just said I got rejected. And then it keeps going and it goes, but it is for some people, the top 2%, the changers, the movers and shakers, but not for everyone. So it was just this intense back and forth, and eventually I did learn that I got accepted, which I was really ecstatic about. And I decided to go there. It was a very impulsive decision, especially at this point. Minerva University was still working in conjunction with another program called the Keck Graduate Institute, so it was Minerva Schools at KGI, so it wasn't even an accredited university, and only one class had graduated. So we were pretty convinced that it was a scam, but I decided to take a chance on it anyways after talking to one of the alleged upperclassmen. They were real, they were really nice, and that change affected everything about my life in the project for the next 4 years. Before starting uni, I had been a part of the Colorado Aquarium Society for 3 years, as I mentioned, and I had over 25 fish tanks. I love my fish, and I was constantly doing things to engage with the hobby whenever I could, but after I graduated high school, I knew that all of that had to change, especially if I was going out of state. So I sold most of my fish and most of my tanks, except for a few that I couldn't bear to part with. I kept my axolotls, my crayfish, and of course my ropefish. Just a quick aside here, I love my ropefish. They were actually one of the species that got me really hooked into the hobby, and I wanted to be the first one to breed them in captivity. So I think that has been accomplished, but it's still very, very rare, so that still stands to be one of my goals. Hopefully you guys can help keep me accountable. When I say I kept them, I actually drove them over to one of my fish friends from the Colorado Aquarium Society, John, who had offered to keep them for me while I was in school. And it was a very bittersweet goodbye because those fish meant a lot to me. They were the ones that I was closest with, especially my ropefish, Sevi, who is my favorite, and I also have a tattoo of him, was also the fish I'd had the longest. My axolotls that I had had since they were an inch long, the dwarf blue crayfish breeding colony I had established, the beautiful ghost crayfish I had bred myself, and the Sherax poulture that I wanted to breed at some point. And while many of these have passed throughout my time at university, I'm glad they were in a place where I was able to watch them, even from a distance. John was amazing, and he would send me picture updates and things like that. Before I left, I also set up a palindarium in a 72-gallon bow front, which had some water and some land, lava rock, and plants, and there was a pump, kind of like pumping water to water the plants, and it was a closed system, and there was nothing inside it but some cherry shrimp coals. And I kept it running actually the whole time I was in college, which it only needed occasional top-ups for water, and the lights and everything ran on a timer. So that was a pretty successful experiment. And the shrimp actually established a self-sustaining population. I mean, that was pretty cool to kind of go home and see how things had changed and what things had stayed the same. Back to university, I think I would have to say that my freshman year of college was the biggest period of personal growth about myself. Since Minerva doesn't actually have a campus, I learned how to adult properly. Meal prepping, grocery shopping, budgeting, gym, working, all while balancing these new and rigorous academics. It was really interesting. I learned a lot about how to interact with people also from different cultures. At Minerva, there are only around 20 students from the US and all the other students are international. There was a lot going on, but going in, I knew I wanted to be more seriously involved with fish. I also wanted to study linguistics, and people have asked me how I plan on kind of melding those two together, and I'm still not sure. Technically, my major is psychology, but what I studied was secondary language acquisition as an adult, which is significantly different from when you try and learn a language or even a second language as a child due to some fun structures of the prefrontal cortex. But every single assignment that I turned in, every single research paper that I had to do, I did about fish. So this kind of quasi-intersection between fish and linguistics were just two of my passions, and that has been really interesting to kind of see what I do with that. And what I landed on was that I want to use the knowledge that I learned to learn other languages that would allow me to travel and engage with communities that are existing around endangered species. And here is when I slowly started to think about the conservation warehouse. Everything kind of got sidetracked at this point though, because I didn't realize how hard university classes were going to be. And they have an active learning model and a novel platform, and I had to really relearn how to study. I worked a lot on time management as well freshman year, and I was one of those people that always turned in assignments a week early, but I wasn't really doing that well in my classes. I was completely missing the point. The rooms were really small. In San Francisco, our first year, and they were shared with 3 people. And while I had amazing roommates who did let me smuggle in fish and like a whole fish tank into our room, it's still difficult learning how to live in close proximity to everyone. For legal reasons, I do want to say that I cannot confirm or deny that I did sneak fish into my room and that the previous statement was maybe not factual. But I also created a small hydroponic system, theoretically, with herbs, and much to the hypothetical surprise of my roommates, it was very successful. So I can't say for sure that we had consistent mint and green onions throughout the semester, but it is a possibility. For this next bit, I will have to give a little bit of context. There are 2 main community events at Minerva our freshman year. There's the 1001s and the Minerva Talks. 1001s are a presentation about a culture or a group where all the people from a certain country get together, present about their culture, and cook food. Those were really amazing and one of the best ideas I've ever seen. But the one we're going to focus on is the second one, the Minerva Talk, when an individual decides to do a presentation about themselves and their lives before Minerva. From these, I learned that my classmates had been studying law and engineering, starting nonprofits, creating YouTube content for huge online communities, and so much more. So when it came to my Minerva Talk, not only did I have to fight imposter syndrome, but I knew I had to include fish somehow. So I made my presentation and divided my life into the same sections you would use when starting a tank. Picking the size, selecting the substrate, stocking the tank, maintaining it, etc. And I represented each aspect of my life with one of those parts, and all of the main people were represented by fish, which I think was a pretty interesting way to share about myself while highlighting the importance of fish in my life. Maybe someday I'll share that presentation for you all instead of just posting a screenshot over the video, but I used Prezi, so it had lots of funky transitions, and it went pretty well. I wanted to talk about the sense of community too that I found outside of my classmates for the fish hobby. I joined the San Francisco Aquarium Society not too long after I moved to San Francisco for the first year, and for the first meeting, I walked 45 minutes to get there through the Tenderloin, which is kind of a rough district. I attended the talk and introduced myself afterwards, and it felt like I was back home. All of the fish hobbyists welcomed me like they had in other cities, and we instantly were able to talk about our passion. One of the friends I made there is named Kevin. So Kevin was a retired police officer, and he and I kind of grew closer throughout the year. We'd sometimes get breakfast together, and we'd always go to the Aquarium Society meetings. So I was really happy to make a good friend. And now he sends me pictures of his Frontosa and Tropheus tanks and links for insane deals on Craigslist for acrylic and glass tanks. I cannot tell you how many times I have wanted to drive down to San Francisco just to get these tanks. There are a lot of rich people in San Francisco with, tech startups or things like that, the tech bros, and they think they want fish. They get this gorgeous acrylic tank, or they get this, beautiful custom made tank, and then after a couple months decide they don't want it, which is fine. I'm just so jealous. of all of the deals that Kevin has found. He was also there one time at the Aquarium Society meeting that we were running behind schedule, and I offered to keep the auction going by being an auctioneer so we could finish on time. So I was really nervous to make a mistake in my pronunciation or kind of misjudge a starting price, but everyone was really patient and made it a really amazing first experience. And that's something I would miss when I started to travel. But we'll get back to that. Freshman year also marked the first time that I flew with fish. So when I went home to visit my family over one of the breaks, I took my hypothetical fish with me. But thankfully I had no problems with TSA. And they did say it was the first time they had ever seen someone fly with fish. They even used it as like a training situation for some of the newer employees. So that was kind of fun. After that break, though, when I got back to San Francisco, we had some networking events that we had to go to. Partners of the school, contacts from faculty, or, people that were somehow connected to the philosophy were all invited to this big networking event. Even though there were some amazing people there, I couldn't find anyone working in conservation, and especially not in the protection of freshwater fish species, which was initially disappointing, but it definitely kicked the project into gear as I started to reach out to the people I did want to connect with so that I could ask for their ideas on the warehouse. Before I get too far into that, our school closed very abruptly for COVID and encouraged all the students to go home if they could. Remember, we have a huge batch of international students. So I rented a car with 2 friends and drove back home to Colorado, where we quarantined for the recommended 2 weeks before being allowed into the main part of the house again. We were quarantined in the basement where all of my fish equipment was. So while I had torn everything down before leaving, I hadn't had the chance to sell or get rid of the empty tanks, and seeing it all there was a reminder of the hobby, and I reached out for more pictures of Sevi because, it was really making me miss them. For the rest of the summer, it was thankfully uneventful, and the remote interviews started. So I want to extend a huge thank you to every person that I talked to over the last few years. I know you took time out of your schedule to meet with me and hear about my idea, and some of you went, further and offered feedback and suggestions and said that you wanted to keep in touch. And the dedication that you all have to the conservation of freshwater species is absolutely mind-blowing. And I'm really thankful for all the help that I've gotten. And that being said, it's time to move on to the next part of our adventure.